Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive?
Absolutely, always ready to dig into some fascinating history.
Well, today we're taking a closer look at Operation Paperclip.
Ah, yes. The U.S. government's recruitment of Nazi scientists after World War II. Always a controversial topic.
You bet. And you've brought some pretty intriguing excerpts for us to explore. Declassified documents, first-hand accounts, historical analyses. Seems like you're aiming to uncover the motivations behind it all, the key players, and those tricky ethical questions that just won't go away.
Right, on all counts. It's a really complex chapter of history, especially when you consider the global landscape at the time. I mean, we're talking about the immediate aftermath of World War II.
Right, the world was kind of holding its breath.
Exactly. You had the looming Cold War and this fierce rivalry between the U.S. and the Soviet Union for, well, pretty much everything, especially scientific and technological superiority.
So the world was like a powder keg, and both sides were looking for any advantage they could get. Is that what led the U.S. to see these German scientists, even with their Nazi ties, as a potential asset?
Precisely. And it wasn't just about a few rocket scientists. This program, which actually started as Operation Overcast before morphing into Paperclip, evolved to encompass expertise in a whole range of fields.
Like what?
Well, you have medicine, chemistry, even biological warfare. The Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, or JIOA, which reported directly to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, was deeply concerned about the Soviets.
I can imagine.
I mean, think about it. Within a year of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they were already predicting an all-out war with the Soviets by 1952. And we're talking about a war involving every weapon imaginable.
Yeah.
Atomic bombs, biological agents, the whole 9 yards.
So recruiting Nazi scientists, even with their, baggage, might have seemed like the lesser of two evils to some.
Yeah, that's the line of thinking at the time.
But where did Operation Paperclip actually begin? Wernher von Braun and his V-2 rocket team often come to mind.
Rightfully so. Von Braun and his team were essential to the development of the V-2 rocket program in Germany. While technologically impressive, we can't forget the human cost. The program relied heavily on slave labor at the Middlework facility. Thousands perished in those tunnels. It's a stark reminder that scientific progress, unfortunately, doesn't always come with clean hands.
It's a troubling duality for sure. Scientific brilliance alongside immense suffering. But I'm also curious about some of the lesser-known figures involved in Operation Paperclip. You included excerpts about Major General Walter Schreiber, the former Surgeon General of the Third Reich.
Ah, Schreiber. His story is particularly disturbing.
It really is. Allegations of human experimentation, attempts to downplay his past, to gain entry into the U.S. It's a lot to unpack.
It is. And it raises some serious questions about the vetting process, or lack thereof, during Operation Paperclip. It seems the desire to acquire scientific knowledge sometimes trumped concerns about past transgressions.
It's a pattern we see throughout history, isn't it? That balancing act between ambition and morality.
All too often.
Then there's Dr. Kurt Blome, head of Nazi Germany's biological weapons program. I'm really interested in the whole debate surrounding his culpability.
Right, the whole intent versus action argument.
Exactly. Some sources suggest there was disagreement about whether he actually conducted human experiments or just planned them.
And that distinction, as you can imagine, became a major sticking point during the Nuremberg trials. The world was grappling with the sheer scale of the Nazi regime's atrocities. It's a tough question. How do you punish someone for something they were planning to do, as opposed to something they actually did?
Bloom's wife, Bettina, who was a doctor herself, tried to defend him by bringing up examples of human experimentation conducted by the U.S. during the war. She even brought up the Walter Reed yellow fever experiments from the early 20th century, where some volunteers, unfortunately, died.
Right, almost like she was trying to say, look, my husband wasn't uniquely evil. He was a product of a scientific culture where ethical boundaries, well, let's just say they weren't always crystal clear.
So she was basically arguing that he wasn't an outlier, just a product of his time.
In a way, yes. It's a complex argument to make.
Because on the one hand, you have to acknowledge that human experimentation, sadly, wasn't unheard of during that era. But on the other hand, there's a vast difference between unethical practices in general and the systematic atrocities carried out by the Nazi regime.
Exactly. There's a world of difference.
And from what I've gathered, Blum was a committed Nazi. There are documents detailing his discussions with Himmler about securing funding and resources for his research on the plague.
The plague?
Yeah. He even proposed field tests using rats to spread the bacteria. I mean, it's chilling.
It is. Makes you wonder, were the Americans so fixated on winning the Cold War that they were willing to turn a blind eye to the moral failings of individuals like Bloom? Or did they genuinely believe they could separate the science from the scientist?
It's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And the thing is, the U.S. wasn't alone in this. You mentioned that the Soviets had their own version of Operation Paperclip. They were scooping up German scientists, too.
Oh, absolutely. It was a full-blown scientific arms race, both sides scrambling to secure the best minds regardless of their past affiliations. The U.S. must have felt immense pressure to keep pace with the Soviets. It might explain some of their, shall we say, questionable choices.
So even if some officials had reservations about Bloom's past, they might have felt they couldn't risk letting him fall into Soviet hands. It's a high-stakes game of chess.
Very much so.
You've also included excerpts about Dr. Otto Ambros.
Ah, Ambrose, the chemist who was instrumental in developing the nerve agent taboon.
Right. Tell me about him.
Well, he was a high-ranking figure in IG Farben.
Wait, IG Farben, wasn't that the company that used slave labor from concentration camps?
Yes, one of the largest chemical companies in the world at the time. They produced everything from dyes and pharmaceuticals to synthetic rubber and, significantly, chemical weapons. They were deeply enmeshed with the Nazi war machine.
I remember reading about them building a factory right next to Auschwitz to take advantage of the captive workforce. It's horrifying.
It is, and Ambrose was directly involved in those operations. There's no denying his brilliance as a scientist, but he was also a ruthless businessman, willing to do whatever it took to advance the goals of both IG Farben and the Nazi regime.
So another case of scientific brilliance intertwined with moral compromise.
Badly, yes.
Didn't Ambrose face trial at Nuremberg for his role in the slave labor program?
He did. He was sentenced to 8 years, but was released early in 1951. And here's where things get interesting. Despite his conviction, his scientific expertise was still in high demand. He ended up consulting for various chemical companies, including some American firms.
So even after being convicted of war crimes, he was able to rebuild his career, partially with the help of the U.S. It seems like they were willing to overlook quite a bit in the pursuit of scientific advancement.
Well, remember, this was the height of the Cold War. The U.S. saw people like Ambrose as potentially valuable assets in the fight against communism. Their knowledge and expertise often overshadowed their past actions.
Is that ever truly justifiable, though? To prioritize strategic advantage over basic moral principles?
It's a tough question. And there are no easy answers. Operation Paperclip forces us to confront the fact that history is rarely black and white. Decisions made during times of crisis are often fraught with ethical dilemmas, and the repercussions can echo for generations.
It's a reminder that we're all shaped by the circumstances we find ourselves in, but we're also responsible for the choices we make within those circumstances.
Exactly. We have to grapple with both sides of that coin.
Speaking of those tough choices, you mentioned Major General Walter Schreiber's story being particularly troubling.
It is.
I'm very curious to hear more about his involvement in the Nazi medical system and how he managed to land a position with the U.S. Army Air Forces, working on aviation medicine in Texas, of all places.
Schreiber's case is the perfect illustration of how the U.S. government initially downplayed the Nazi connections of the scientists they recruited.
So they were actively trying to hide it.
It seems so. They presented these individuals as eminent specialists, not as former members of a regime responsible for genocide. Clearly, they were trying to manage the narrative, to control the public perception.
But eventually the truth came out, right? Didn't the Boston Globe expose Schreiber's Nazi ties in 1951? I imagine that created quite a stir.
Oh, it did. It sparked a massive scandal. Congressional hearings, widespread public outrage. It really shone a light on the entire Operation Paperclip program, forcing the U.S. government to finally address some of the hard questions about their recruitment practices.
What was Schreiber's reaction when his past was revealed? Did he show any remorse for his actions during the war?
It's strange, but he seemed genuinely surprised by the backlash. He insisted that he was just a scientist serving his country and claimed to have no knowledge of any war crimes.
But as the former Surgeon General of the Third Reich, wouldn't he have been at least somewhat aware of what was happening within the Nazi medical system?
It seems incredibly unlikely that he could have been completely oblivious. Evidence suggests he attended meetings where human experimentation was discussed. There are even witness testimonies placing him at concentration camps where these experiments were taking place.
It sounds like a classic case of denial, maybe even self-deception. Perhaps he convinced himself that he was above it all, a purely objective scientist, untainted by the ideology of the regime he served.
It's possible. There's also this rather chilling account from the Nuremberg trials where Schreiber mentions a visit from Dr. Kurt Bloom, who was fleeing the advancing Red Army.
Bloom, the one who was researching the plague.
The very same. He was panicking because the Soviets had captured his lab, and he knew they would find evidence of his human experiments.
So even if Schreiber wasn't directly involved in those experiments, his association with Bloom suggests he was at least aware of what was going on within the Nazi medical research apparatus. Did Schreiber ever face any real consequences for his actions?
Eventually, public pressure forced the U.S. Air Force to cut ties with him. But he wasn't prosecuted or punished for any crimes. He ended up fleeing to Argentina.
Argentina.
Yes, which at the time was a safe haven for many former Nazis.
So he escaped accountability. It seems like the Cold War really did overshadow the pursuit of justice in many instances.
It's a frustrating truth, but it reflects the complicated reality of the post-war period. The U.S. government was hyper-focused on combating communism, and that focus sometimes came at the expense of moral reckoning.
It seems like expediency won out over morality far too often. It makes you wonder about the long-term consequences of such compromises.
It's a question worth pondering. The pursuit of knowledge and power, especially in times of crisis, can easily lead to ethical blind spots. The legacy of Operation Paperclip serves as a potent reminder of the importance of moral reflection, even when faced with what might feel like unavoidable necessities.
Before we jump into the broader ramifications of Operation Paperclip and its lasting legacy, let's dig a little deeper into some of these individual scientists. Their lives and the choices they made offer a unique lens through which to view the complexities of this era. Let's start with Dr. Kurt Bloom. I'm particularly interested in the specifics of his alleged involvement in biological weapons research and that ongoing debate about his intent versus his actions.
Excellent. Bloom's case is a microcosm of the ethical dilemmas at the heart of Operation Paperclip. So Bloom, he openly admitted to leading the Nazi biological weapons program. Now, that in itself wasn't actually a crime at the time.
Well, why not?
Lots of countries were researching biological weapons during the war. It was, well, a different time. But the Soviets, they accused him of being deeply involved in planning some pretty horrific human experiments.
And I imagine the Soviets would have had access to evidence, right?
Oh, absolutely. They captured Bloom's main research facility in Poland.
I see. So what did they find?
His bacteriological institute at Nesselstedt, near Poznan, fell right into their hands. And they claimed to have found some unsettling equipment there. Steam chambers, incubators, deep freezers, all seemingly designed for working with dangerous pathogens.
That's not good. But when the U.S. interrogated Bloom, he insisted he never actually conducted any of those experiments.
Right. He maintained that intent and action were two separate things.
Which I imagine is a pretty tricky legal defense, especially given the whole context of the Nuremberg trials.
Exactly. The world was reeling from the horrors of the Nazi regime, and here's this guy basically arguing, well, I just thought about it, didn't actually do it. Tough sell.
And to complicate matters further, Bloom's wife, Bettina, she enters the picture. She's a doctor herself, and she starts digging up information about human experiments conducted by the U.S. during the war.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. It's almost like she was trying to create this moral equivalency argument.
I see. To diminish her husband's culpability.
Right. She even brought up the Walter Reed yellow fever experiments from the early 1900s, where, unfortunately, some volunteers did die.
It's classic whataboutism, isn't it? But it does raise some interesting questions, I'll grant you that. Was Bloom truly a monster in his own right? Or was he just a product of his time, operating within a scientific community where human experimentation, as horrific as it is to us now, wasn't completely out of the realm of possibility?
It's a difficult question. But from what I've read, the documents seem to paint a pretty damning picture. He comes across as a deeply committed Nazi. There's correspondence where he's directly discussing these experiments with Himmler, asking for funding and resources for his research on the plague.
No way, the plague.
The plague. He even proposed field tests, can you believe it? Using rats to spread plague bacteria. I mean, it's absolutely terrifying.
It is. And it circles back to that core ethical dilemma of Operation Paperclip. Were the Americans so laser-focused on winning the Cold War that they were willing to simply ignore the moral transgressions of people like Bloom?
Right. Was it truly a case of separating the science from the scientist? Or was it just cold, hard pragmatism in the face of what they perceived as an existential threat?
Tough to say for sure.
And we can't forget about the pressure from the Soviets. You mentioned they were actively recruiting German scientists, too. Did that competitive pressure factor into the U.S.'s decisions?
Oh, absolutely. It created this scientific arms race, a scramble to acquire the best minds, regardless of their past. The U.S. probably felt like they couldn't let someone like Bloom fall into Soviet hands, even if they had serious reservations.
It's like this high-stakes game of chess where each move has these massive implications. So what happened to Bloom in the end?
Well, despite the Soviet accusations and the evidence they presented, Bloom was never actually tried at Nuremberg for war crimes related to biological warfare or human experimentation.
Really? Why not?
There simply wasn't enough concrete evidence to directly link him to specific atrocities.
Wow. So he basically got away with it.
Well, not entirely. He was later tried and convicted in West Germany for the euthanasia of mental patients.
Ah, right. I'd forgotten about that. So while he might have escaped accountability for his potential role in biological weapons research, he did eventually face justice for other crimes.
It's a complicated outcome, but I guess it highlights the immense challenges of seeking justice after a conflict as horrific as World War II. The lines between scientific ambition, political pressure, and moral responsibility were often blurred.
Let's switch gears a bit and dive into another figure from your research, Major General Walter Schreiber, the former Surgeon General of the Third Reich, who, as we mentioned earlier, ended up working on aviation medicine for the U.S. Army Air Forces in Texas. How on earth did that happen?
Schreiber's case, it really exemplifies how the U.S. government initially tried to downplay the Nazi connections of the scientists they recruited.
So they were deliberately trying to hide it.
It seems so. They presented these individuals as eminent specialists, carefully avoiding any mention of their roles in the Nazi regime. Clearly, they were trying to control the narrative to shape public perception.
But as we know, the truth has a way of coming out. You mentioned that Boston Globe expose of Schreiber's Nazi past back in 1951. I can't imagine that went over well.
It was a huge scandal. Congressional hearings, public outcry, the works. It really forced the U.S. government to finally confront the ethical implications of Operation Paperclip and answer some tough questions about the rather lax vetting process.
So what was Schreiber's reaction when his past was revealed? Did he express any remorse, any regret for his actions during the war?
You know, it's strange. He seemed genuinely surprised by the backlash. He insisted he was just a scientist serving his country and claimed to have no knowledge of any war crimes.
But as the former Surgeon General of the Third Reich, wouldn't he have at least been aware of what was happening within the Nazi medical system? I mean, that seems almost impossible to believe.
It does, doesn't it? There's evidence he attended meetings where human experimentation was discussed. There are witness testimonies placing him at concentration camps where these experiments were taking place.
It sounds like a textbook case of denial, maybe even deliberate self-deception. It's as if he convinced himself he was somehow, above it all, this purely objective scientist, untainted by the horrific ideology of the regime he served.
It's a possibility. And then there's this really chilling account from the Nuremberg trials where Schreiber describes a visit from, of all people, Dr. Kurt Bloom.
Bloom, the plague guy.
Yes. He was fleeing the advancing Red Army, utterly panicked because the Soviets had captured his lab and he knew they would find evidence of his human experiments.
So even if Schreiber wasn't directly involved in those experiments, his association with Bloom suggests he was at least aware of what was going on. Did he ever face any consequences for his actions?
Well, public pressure eventually forced the U.S. Air Force to sever ties with him, but he wasn't prosecuted or punished for any crimes. He actually managed to escape to Argentina.
Argentina?
Yep, which at the time was a haven for a lot of former Nazis.
Wow. So he essentially escaped accountability altogether.
He did. And it's just another example of how the Cold War, the fear of communism, often overshadowed the pursuit of justice for Nazi crimes.
It's a frustrating reality, but it speaks to the complexities of the post-war period.
Exactly. The U.S. government was so fixated on combating communism that they often made compromises, moral compromises, that had long-lasting consequences.
It really makes you think.
It does. And it's a reminder that the pursuit of knowledge and power, especially in times of crisis, can lead us down some very dangerous paths.
Paths paved with ethical blind spots.
Precisely.
Before we shift our focus to the legacy of Operation Paperclip, I'd like to touch briefly on Dr. Hubertus Strauchold, often called the father of space medicine.
Oh, yes. Strauchold. A fascinating but complicated figure.
His story seems less overtly sinister than Bloom or Schreiber, but it still raises some ethical red flags.
It does. His contributions to aviation medicine and space exploration are undeniable. but there's increasing evidence linking him to human experiments conducted by the Luftwaffe during the war.
Those experiments were often conducted on concentration camp prisoners, subjecting them to extreme conditions to test the limits of human endurance. It's really hard to reconcile his scientific accomplishments with his potential complicity in those acts.
It's a stark reminder that even people who make significant contributions to science can have very dark chapters in their past. It forces us to confront those uncomfortable questions about separating the person from their work. Can we, should we, celebrate the achievements while acknowledging the harm that was done?
It also highlights the fact that history is rarely black and white. There are layers of nuance and complexity that can really challenge our understanding of right and wrong.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to approach these stories with humility, recognizing that we're dealing with human beings who made choices, sometimes terrible choices, within a specific historical context. Our goal shouldn't be to simply judge the past, but to learn from it.
Speaking of learning from the past, I think it's time we explore the long-term impact of Operation Paperclip. How did this program shape the trajectory of American science and technology? What are the lasting ethical questions it raises?
Those are crucial questions, and they get to the heart of why Operation Paperclip continues to fascinate and trouble us so many decades later. It really is a mixed bag when you consider the long-term impacts of Operation Paperclip.
How so?
Well, on the one hand, there's no denying that it contributed to some of America's greatest achievements. I mean, we're talking rocketry, space exploration, aviation medicine, even chemical weapons development.
Wow. So it really did have a sweeping impact.
Oh, absolutely. And the knowledge and expertise that these German scientists brought with them, it played a direct role in the U.S. winning the space race and, of course, in developing new technologies. Technologies that had applications in both the military and civilian sectors.
So from a purely practical standpoint, it was successful.
You could say that. But of course, we can't forget about the ethical compromises we've been discussing.
Right? That willingness to overlook the Nazi affiliations of these scientists, all in the name of national security.
Exactly. And for a long time, the U.S. government worked very hard to keep those compromises under wraps. They wanted to protect that image of American scientific progress, to present a sanitized version of history.
But as we've seen, the truth has a way of bubbling to the surface. When did that reckoning with Operation Paperclip really begin? When did those cracks in the facade start to show?
It was a gradual process, for sure, but I'd say the 1980s were a turning point.
The 1980s.
Yeah, the Office of Special Investigations, the OSI, which was tasked with, well, investigating Nazi war criminals living in the U.S., started to focus on some of the scientists brought over through Paperclip.
I see. And did they find anything?
Oh, yes. One of the most prominent cases involved Arthur Rudolph.
Rudolph?
He was a key figure in the development of the Saturn V rocket. You know, the one that launched the Apollo missions to the moon.
Oh, wow. So this was a top-tier scientist.
Absolutely brilliant engineer, but also a committed Nazi. He oversaw the production of V-2 rockets at the Middlework facility, the same place where thousands of slave laborers died in horrific conditions.
It's hard to fathom that someone could be involved in something so horrific and still contribute to such groundbreaking scientific achievements.
It is. And Rudolph, he remained unapologetic about his past, even expressed support for some aspects of Hitler's ideology.
Unbelievable.
The OSI confronted him with evidence of his role in the slave labor program, and, well, he eventually chose to renounce his U.S. citizenship and return to Germany rather than face potential prosecution.
So he essentially fled.
Essentially, yes.
That must have been a blow to the image of the American space program, to have one of its leading figures exposed as a former Nazi overseeing slave labor.
It was. And it really tarnished the legacy of the Apollo program, at least to some extent.
It's a reminder that progress isn't always linear, that there are often dark chapters hidden beneath the surface of even our greatest achievements.
Exactly. And Rudolph's case, along with a number of others, forced a serious reassessment of the ethical foundations of American scientific progress. I mean, how much of that progress was built on the backs of slave labor, on knowledge gained through exploitation and suffering?
Those are really tough questions to grapple with. It's hard to fully celebrate achievements when you know they're intertwined with such darkness. It casts a long shadow.
It does. And those questions, they continue to resonate today, not just in relation to Operation Paperclip, but in any field where scientific progress might be linked to unethical practices or historical injustices.
It's a reminder that we can't just sweep the past under the rug and pretend it didn't happen.
Exactly.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive into Operation Paperclip, What are the key takeaways? What can we learn from this complex and often troubling chapter of history?
I think Operation Paperclip offers us several important lessons. First and foremost, it reminds us that science is never truly neutral. Scientists are human beings, capable of both incredible good and incredible evil. Their work can be used for noble purposes or for truly horrific ends. And the context in which science operates, it matters. It matters a lot.
It also seems to highlight the danger of prioritizing national security above everything else, above ethical considerations. When expediency trumps morality, we risk compromising the very values and principles we claim to defend.
Absolutely. And the ramifications of those compromises can ripple through generations. Operation Paperclip is a cautionary tale about what happens when pragmatism and fear take precedence over our core values.
And it underscores the importance of remembering, of holding on to that historical memory, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. We can't simply bury the past and pretend it didn't happen. We have a responsibility to acknowledge the wrongs that were committed, to learn from them, and to try to do better.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And that learning process requires a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths, to challenge our assumptions, and to engage in honest, open dialogue about the ethical implications of scientific progress.
Well, this has been an incredibly enlightening deep dive. Operation Paperclip was a truly complex and controversial program, and its legacy continues to shape how we view the relationship between science, ethics, and history.
I agree. It's a story that forces us to ask some tough questions about our values, our priorities, and the choices we make as a society. Questions that are just as relevant today as they were all those decades ago.
It's been a pleasure unraveling this complex story with you. Thank you for sharing your expertise.
The pleasure was all mine.
And to our listeners, we hope this exploration has provided some valuable insights, perhaps inspired you to delve deeper into this fascinating and challenging chapter of history on your own. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.